I'm going to let people in.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, Gary. Sorry to be so late.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Dan, if would you like to introduce, or shall I go for it?
Would you mind, Ian?
Not at all. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this 7th in the series of Historic Ridgeway presentations. This evening we have Professor of Archaeology from Oxford University, Gary Lock, giving his talk on living with the White Horse. Professor Lock, I'll pass over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I'm assuming that you can hear me, but just let people know in the chat if you can't. I'm going to be talking about living with the White Horse, and what I'm really talking about are the excavation of 3 hill forts around the White Horse. So the reason for the title, Living with the White Horse, is really because the assumption is that the people who built and used the 3 hill forts I shall be talking about were also responsible for building and using the White Horse. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Uffington White Horse and will be familiar with the sites that I'm going to be talking about. If you're concerned about the image that you can see on the screen there's no need to be, because the jockey was only there for a couple of days, and the jockey is actually some kind of foam that a local company used as an advertising stunt, but they did have permission from the National Trust to actually do it. So before I start any talk on hill forts, I always introduce this project, which if you're interested in hill forts, you really should know about. First of all, there is a website. This is called the Atlas of Hill Forts of Britain and Ireland. And there's a website, and you can see the URL for it there, where you get information on 4,147 hill forts across England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. There is a book that goes with it, but I don't think you'll be rushing out to buy that because it costs about £150. But the website is free. So if you want to access it, you can find as much information as you probably want on any of the hill forts in Britain and Ireland, and certainly the ones I'm going to be talking about this evening. So from the Atlas, we can see that there are 38 hill forts in Oxfordshire, and what I'm going to be talking about are part of this little group in the southern part of Oxfordshire there. So the 3 excavations I shall be talking about took place at Uffington Castle and the White Horse, at Segsbury Camp, which is a hill fort just above the village of Letcombe Regis, and Alfred's Castle, which is a lovely little hill fort just south of the Ridgeway and in the grounds of Ashdown House, which is a National Trust property. Now, obviously, the thing that links all of these hill forts and many of the others that you can see on this plan is the Ridgeway itself. So the Ridgeway is this dotted line, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is why you're here this evening. It's the dotted line, and to the south of the dotted line are the chalk downlands, and to the north is the Vale of the White Horse. Now, you can see that there are lots of hill forts in this area. Not least Cherbury Camp, which is a lovely low-lying hill fort in the Vale of the White Horse. Liddington and Barbary over to the west are 2 hill forts that are well worth visiting if you've not been there, and there are several others as well. But what I'm going to concentrate on is the 3 that we excavated a few years ago and how they relate to the White Horse itself. Now, other than digging holes, archaeologists like to think about sort of bigger questions. And here we have a couple of things, well, in fact, 3 things that I'd like us to bear in mind as we go through this talk. The first is this idea or this concept of continuity. Archaeologists talk about continuity quite a lot, and it's a term that we use quite freely without really defining what we mean by it, other than it's people returning to the same place over a long period of time and doing things at the same place over and over again. The time period that I'm going to be covering in this talk is approximately from about 1000 BC, which is the late Bronze Age, until about the 5th century AD, which is the end of the Romano-British period. So we've got about 1500 years there, where we'll see from some of the sites that I talk about that people return time and time again to the same site. So we can call that continuity. What I'd like us to think about is why people would do that. And here I'm going to introduce the idea of prehistoric history. Now, this might sound like a bit of a contradiction, because prehistory by definition is before writing, whereas history is based on written records. But we know from anthropology, we know from groups of people around the world that don't have writing, that they still have a very, very strong sense of history. And that history is often passed on verbally, and often verbally it's passed on through specific locations in the landscape. And these are sometimes called historical mnemonics. And a mnemonic is a place in the landscape or something that triggers thoughts and ideas, and in this case would trigger stories about the history of the particular group. So what I'm suggesting here is that by returning to certain places in the landscape, that would instill a sense of history and reinforce a sense of history for any particular group of people through the telling of stories. And the telling of stories. The third thing to think about, or the second thing, is the idea of hill forts as a class of site. I mean, we talk about hill forts quite sort of freely as if they're all the same thing. And if you look at a lot of them as we see them today, they're banks and ditches, and they do look very similar, don't they? But once you get down to the detail of excavation, we'll see that they can actually be quite different. So here we've got the idea of a social template. Hill forts were constructed in the late Bronze Age, Iron Age periods across large areas of Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, and into Britain and Ireland. And they're all sort of similar in that they're enclosed sites, often on the tops of hills, but not always. So there's some kind of social template going on there. But when you look at the details, they're actually quite different. So people are working within a social template, but they're adding their own ideas and their own variations of that particular theme. So let's start first of all with Uffington Castle. Here we can see the LiDAR plot of Uffington Castle on the left, and on the right we can see the Google image of the hill fort. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. The White Horse is up to the north there, and we'll see that it's got an entrance to the west. There is an entrance to the east that was blocked, which I'll talk about, and it's got a single rampart around it. It's got a ditch, and then it's got what we call a counterscarp bank, which is another bank on the outer side of the ditch. Now, what we need to bear in mind is that the hill fort itself is part of a real complex of monuments on White Horse Hill. So we've got the hill fort that we can see here. The Ridgeway runs just to the south of it. The earliest monument is this long barrow, which is called the Long Mound, and that is Neolithic, so it dates back to the 3rd or 4th millennium BC. Outside the hill fort we've got what we call the western enclosure, which I'll talk about. Coming up to the hill fort across the downs from the south, we've got the linear ditch, which I'll talk about. And then we've got some round barrows, early Bronze Age and Saxon round barrows. So there's a whole complex of monuments that span a very long period of time on the top of this hill. Let's look in a bit more detail at Uffington Castle. So here we're looking through the western entrance, and on this shoulder of land outside the western entrance is what we call the western enclosure. Here it shows as a crop mark, so that's the western entrance. You can see this rectangular enclosure. It shows as a crop mark on an aerial photograph. There's a trackway leading towards the modern Ridgeway, which runs there, and inside it is a completely ploughed out round barrow. The linear ditch runs up from the south, as you can see there, and I'll say something about that in a minute. So this western enclosure enclosed what must have been an extant round barrow in the Roman times. What's left of it now is just the ditch. It's been heavily ploughed, as all of this area. You can see the plough marks in the chalk there. This is a Roman burial within this enclosure. And this is all that's left of the ditch of this, what would have been a ditched and banked enclosure. And in the bottom of the ditch, we found Roman pottery. You can see the filling of the ditch there. And this is a Roman burial. So this is definitely a Roman enclosure on a shoulder of land outside the western entrance of the hill fort. The enclosure we've just looked at, this is looking northwards from the south. That's the ramparts of the hill fort. Here we've got this shoulder of land with the enclosure on it, and running up to the hill fort is this thing called the linear ditch. It's a bit of a daft name, really, because by definition, ditches are always linear. But anyway, these are called linear ditches. There's a whole complex of them over the Wessex Downs. They predate hill forts, so they're dated to the late Bronze Age, probably about 900, 800, 700 BC. This one, we put a few trenches across it, as you can see. So this is the modern Ridgeway running there, just south of the hill fort. And the section that you can see here is the section there across the modern Ridgeway. Notice that you can see the linear ditch running across the modern Ridgeway as this dark stain. So what you can see in this section is a typical profile of a linear ditch, V-shaped, cut through the chalk bedrock. So there would have been a bank on one side of the material dug from the ditch. Notice that at the bottom of the ditch, there's some dark fill, and this is late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, natural infilling by erosion of the ditch. And then all of this big wodge of lighter stuff at the top with this chalk surface was thrown in there in the early Roman period, probably 2nd century AD, to create the Ridgeway in its current location. So the Ridgeway was established in this location south of the hill fort in about the 2nd century AD, and the Romans filled in the linear ditch and put this chalk surface over the top of it. The relationship between linear ditches and hill forts is an interesting one, and normally linear ditches are earlier, and there's quite a few examples of hill forts being constructed either on the end of a linear ditch, as in this case, or at the junction of 2 or more linear ditches, as we'll see at Alfred's Castle. So let's look at the ramparts of Uffington, and here we can see we've got 2 definite phases of rampart, both of them dated by pottery. We've got a very good, well-dated sequence of pottery in this area of central southern England. And in the 7th century BC, the first phase rampart was constructed. This was called a box rampart. And here you can see the outer face of the rampart, this row of post holes. This is the inner face, and then there was a ditch on the outside. So posts on the outside, posts on the inside. Between the posts, it would have been filled with either planks or turfs, and material from the ditch was filled into this so-called box, and there was probably some kind of walkway along the top. The second phase is what's called a dump rampart. And in the 4th century BC, this box rampart was beginning to deteriorate. There's evidence for posts being replaced because they rotted. And the whole thing was covered with material from a much, much deeper ditch, chucked over the top of the box rampart to create a dump rampart. So in this little diagram at the bottom, the first phase box rampart is red and the dump rampart is the more browny orangey colour. And you can see the ditch is much bigger and it covers the eroding box rampart. The material on the outside of the ditch is what we call a counterscarp bank, and it's thought that this was from them cleaning the ditch, regular cleaning of the ditch, and throwing the material onto the outside to create this little bank. Some practical experiments have shown that if you dig a ditch this deep through chalk, within 2 or 3 winters, it starts to erode fairly quickly. So you need to clean it out to keep it looking nice and pristine. Now, an interesting thing that our excavations showed was that after the second phase dump rampart completely replaced the box rampart, there was then possibly a period of what we called abandonment, where there was no evidence for very much going on inside the hill fort at all. Let's talk about entrances. So here we can see the the ridgeway running to the south of the hill fort along there. This is where the western enclosure is that we've already looked at. This is the western entrance, a very nice outturned entrance that connects the counterscarp bank with the rampart itself to create a corridor entrance. The linear ditch runs up from the south there. And on the eastern side, where there's this big wiggle in the rampart, that is a blocked entrance. So in the first phase box rampart, there were 2 opposing entrances, one there, which is still open, and one there, which was blocked when they constructed the second phase dump rampart in 400 BC. So they just built it straight across the top of the earlier entrance. Now, some people have suggested, and I think there might be some mileage in this, that originally the hill fort was constructed over the top of the ridgeway. So the ridgeway was already in existence. They constructed the hill fort so the ridgeway ran through the middle of it. And there are other examples of hill forts very close or on the ridgeway with opposing entrances, and quite often one is later blocked. And so when they blocked that, we need to know where the ridgeway could have moved to, because in the 2nd century AD, the early Roman period, the ridgeway was established here. So it started there, it ended up there, and I think the period in between, it may well have ran north of the hill fort to take in the White Horse, and we'll talk about the construction of the White Horse and how it relates to this in a minute. So this is the blocked entrance. It was a tricky bit of excavation. You can see some very large post holes, which were gate posts. So here, the cursor is moving along the rampart. So we're looking into the interior through the phase 1 entrance. That's a gatepost hole, that's a gatepost hole, that's a gatepost hole, that's a gatepost hole, and that is a revetting slot for a wooden revetment of the entrance passage. The phase 1 rampart bulged outwards. You can see this curve of post holes there, and there's another curve of post holes there to give a widened end to the ramparts to create a corridor through the phase 1 entrance. The interior of Uffington during the Iron Age, there wasn't very much going on at all, really. We did geophysics. It showed a few pits like these, a few post holes. This is an Iron Age pit being excavated. But there was actually no indication that the hill fort was very densely occupied or permanently occupied. So I think, like perhaps some other hill forts, it was much more a sort of central place where people would go and meet, because what we're talking about here is a very dispersed community. These people were farmers. They lived in farmsteads across the downs and down in the vale. And so a hill fort would be a sort of central place where they could all meet at certain times of the year to take part in certain ceremonies, to trade, to feast. There is evidence for feasting in hill forts, rather than it being a permanently occupied place. Now we move on to the Romano-British, what we call reuse of the Iron Age hill fort. So all of the features that were excavated, this is an Iron Age pit, had this big thick wodge of Romano-British soil on the top. And this was rich in artifacts. There was glass, nails, coins, pottery, all sorts of Roman things being either intentionally deposited or lost or left inside the hill fort. There was also this little Romano-British bread oven. You can see the burning around it in the middle of the hill fort. So there was a lot of activity in the middle of this hill fort through the Roman period. Now let's just say a few words about the White Horse to see how it fits in with this. First of all, the dating of it. When during the Second World War, the White Horse was covered over because it was an obvious landmark for the Luftwaffe to get their bearings from. After the Second World War, it was uncovered by this man, W.F. Grimes, and he was a little bit naughty because he dug a hole at the so-called beak, which is at the end of the head of the White Horse. And here you can see Grimes's hole re-excavated. So underneath the White Horse, as you see it today, there is over a metre of stratigraphy before you hit the bedrock. And within this metre of stratigraphy, there are earlier versions of the horse interleaved with hill wash that has been washed down from the hill. Now, we did some optically stimulated luminescence dating, OSL dating, which dates the last time that quartz was exposed to sunlight. It's a fairly crude technique. The technology has improved a huge amount now from when we did it a long time ago. And in fact, there have been some new OSL samples taken, but we've not yet got the dates. But the 3 samples that were taken in the 1990s gave 3 dates of 1000 BC plus or minus 600. Now, the plus or minus 300. The plus or minus 300 is the standard deviation. So like a radiocarbon date, we would argue that you need to work to 2 standard deviations to get a 95% chance of the real date. So if you look at these date ranges here, that's at 1 standard deviation where you've got a 68% chance of the real date being within that. And this is at 2 standard deviations where you've got a 95% chance of the real date being within that. Now, this is not accurate enough to tell us whether the White Horse was constructed during the first phase construction of the hill fort, 700 BC, or with the second phase construction of the hill fort, 400 BC. My feeling is that it was probably related to the second phase construction of the hill fort, and also related to the blocking of the western entrance and the establishment of the Ridgeway to the north of the hill fort, so it went past the horse, where people could take part in various rituals and whatever they did with the horse. Now, this is accurate enough, fortunately, to tell us that the White Horse is prehistoric, which was one argument before the OSL dating, based on the stylistic grounds, because there are similar horses on Iron Age coins, and it is actually nothing to do with King Alfred, which was the other suggested dating of the White Horse by local historians, because we know that Alfred fought the Danes in this area, and we know that Alfred rode a white horse. So the story that we've got for Uffington then and White Horse Hill, we've got a pre-hill fort landscape with a long barrow, round barrows, early Bronze Age. We've got a late Bronze Age landscape with the linear ditch. There are also late Bronze Age settlements. There's one just along the Ridgeway called Tower Hill that was excavated at the same time as Uffington Castle, late Bronze Age settlement. The date of the horse, we're not sure about, but was it related to the first phase construction, the second phase construction of the hill fort? Hill fort, definitely 2 phases, but then little evidence for what happened for the next 600 years until the Romans arrived, or the Romano-British. But one thing we have to remember is the scouring of the horse. It's generally accepted that if this horse is not scoured, and that means hammering chalk into the surface of it, which is partly responsible for the metre of stratigraphy that we've seen underneath it, if the horse is not scoured every 30 or 35 years or so, then it would grow over. So it's quite remarkable to think that, you know, if this horse is 2,500 years old, people have been cleaning it and looking after it for all of that time. So the Roman period is very interesting at White Horse Hill. We've got the western enclosure that we've looked at. We've got 2 breaks in the ramparts, one there and one there. We've got 50 odd Roman burials in the top of the Neolithic Long Mound, which the local squire excavated in the Victorian period. And so what I'm suggesting is that this was a very special, sacred place based on the age of the horse, because in the Roman period, the horse could have well have been, and probably was, already an ancient monument. So there would have been stories about it, who created it, how was it created. I think the western enclosure was some kind of rural shrine. It's been entirely ploughed away now. This break through the rampart connects with the Ridgeway. So if you're traveling a long distance along the Ridgeway to see this monument, that's the way into the hill fort, where you can deposit your offerings or have a picnic or whatever. If you want to get from the middle of the hill fort to see the horse, that's the obvious place to break through the rampart. So both of those breaks through the rampart were established in the Roman period. And I think here we can see a good example of history being inscribed on the landscape through mythology, the mythology of the horse. You can well imagine that people would be coming here and talking about the horse and talking about their own history. If we move on to Segsbury Camp, which is about 12 kilometres or 8 miles east along the Ridgeway. So again, the LiDAR image, this is the Ridgeway running along there. The road going through the middle of Segsbury is relatively modern. We traced it back on maps to the early 18th century. You can see that Segsbury is a big hill fort. It's the biggest hill fort in Oxfordshire. It's got an entrance to the east. It's probably got a blocked entrance on the west as well, although that's not been confirmed. The Ridgeway runs to the south of it. The modern road is nothing to do with the hill fort. We did geophysics over the interior, and what was established from the geophysics was a series of what we called house pit groups. But what we also noticed from the geophysics was that just inside the rampart was a pre-rampart ditch that ran all the way around the inside of the rampart. And this, we think, is a marking out ditch. So before they constructed the rampart, they dug this little ditch around the circuit where they wanted to build the rampart. Dating of Segsbury, again from pottery, is slightly different to Uffington. It started in the 6th century, and by the 2nd century BC, it was finished. So this is what I mean by house pit groups. So this is an extract from the geophysics. You can see a roundhouse and a group of pits. And there were about between 15 and 20 of these house pit groups in the interior of Segsbury. So again, this doesn't really suggest long-term dense occupation, but I'll talk about what it could be in a minute. Here you can see the one that we excavated. This is the roundhouse foundation gully, and these are pits. This is a pit being excavated by Oxford students. A couple of things to notice on this image. First of all, that around there is an earlier house gully, foundation gully. You can perhaps just pick it out. And this has been cut through by pits. So the pits are obviously later and were dug after the house was no longer standing. Notice that many of the pits are intercutting. So rather than digging a pit into virgin chalk, they seem to like to dig pits into already filled in pits. And one thing that struck us about these pits is that they were dug, and then the very clean chalk that was taken out of the pit was fairly quickly thrown back into the pit to fill it. So the pits didn't stay open for very long. Various sorts of offerings were thrown into the pit, pottery, bits of ironwork, 1 or 2 bits of human remains. So the pits certainly weren't for storage, which is often quoted as the use of Iron Age pits, that these were not storage pits. Now, an interesting thing about the Segsbury house is the orientation of its entrance. Some Iron Age scholars have done studies of the orientation of entrances of Iron Age houses. And here you can see that the vast majority of them face towards the east or the southeast. Vast majority of Iron Age roundhouse entrances. And this is a reconstructed Iron Age roundhouse from Little Butser Park in Hampshire. Now, the reason people have argued for this is possibly a pragmatic, practical reason. It's to get the morning sun. You want the sun to shine through your front door first thing in the morning. The other possibility that's been put forward is a bit more sort of subtle than that. And again, this is based on anthropology, and it's to do with the sort of significance of the east versus the west. So you've got sunrise versus sunset. You've got light versus darkness. You've got good versus evil. You've got life versus death. And there are groups around the world that do believe in those sorts of things and the importance of the East and the sort of fear involved in the West. Now, you'll notice that some of the roundhouse entrances don't fit the general pattern. And in fact, the Segsbury house entrance is to the west. So it's one of these. Now, the interesting thing about the Segsbury house is that in a large post hole or small pit just outside the Segsbury house, and this is it, was the articulated torso of a young man. So his head, his arms and his legs had been cut off and his torso was shoved down into this hole in the ground. And on the other side of the house, in a similar hole, there were two halves of a human skull, which were placed inside each other. So they'd been it had been cut into half and placed inside each other and then put inside a hole. So is this house something to do with death, or is it is that just a coincidence? The rampart itself is massive, much bigger than the Uffington rampart. Here you can see we're excavating a section through it on the relatively modern road which runs through the middle of it. So underneath the rampart there were ard marks. An ard is a prehistoric plough that doesn't turn a furrow. You just drag it through the ground, and if it hits the bedrock like soft chalk, it can make these ard marks. So the rampart itself was probably 4 versions of a box rampart, and here you can see some of the post voids of the rear face of one of the box ramparts, and they're the front face of a couple of the versions of the box rampart, which was finally covered with a massive dump rampart with a revetting wall of sarsen stones at the back. Now, this is the rock cut ditch outside the rampart at Segsbury. You can see a person standing in the bottom of the ditch there. I mean, this is an absolutely incredible project of civil engineering. To actually dig this ditch all around the circuit of Segsbury and to construct the massive rampart. I mean, it was an absolutely monumental task, and we should not underestimate these people for doing that. A couple of interesting things about the rampart itself. In the middle of the rampart, one of the phases of box rampart, there was this funny little structure which in fact wasn't structural. It didn't add to the structure of the rampart. It was just laid in the middle, and it looked different to the chalk of Segsbury. And we had a geologist look at it, and it's what we call exotic stone. It was green chalk, and it was brought from a few kilometers along the Ridgeway, and it was deposited into the middle of one of the phases of the rampart. Now, we sort of realized when we were excavating this that at one point during the construction of the rampart suddenly got much bigger, and we thought that would have taken probably 10 times more people to build the big rampart as opposed to the small one. Now, when our pottery expert, Lisa Brown, who looks at Iron Age pottery, came back to us with the pottery, she said there's something very odd happening in the 4th century. Don't forget that Segsbury was first constructed in the 6th century and ended in the 2nd. So the 4th century is sort of the middle of its life, so to speak. And she said in the 4th century, before the 4th century, the pottery was all local. She could tell this by looking at the fabrics. From the 4th century onwards, the pottery was coming from much further afield. It was probably coming up the Ridgeway because some of it was coming from Wiltshire. Now that's sort of interesting when you think about this exotic stone also suddenly appearing in the 4th century. So it looks as though in the 4th century BC, Segsbury, for some reason, suddenly expanded its area of influence. And rather than just being of local importance, it became of much wider importance. People were coming from much further afield, and they were bringing with them bits of chalk and perhaps other things from their own place where they lived and depositing them in the interior of the rampart. So to summarize Segsbury then, it again was, I think, a communal place developed as a centre for a very dispersed population. It was not permanently occupied. People would go there at certain times of the year. It expanded its catchment in the 4th century. There was a big focus on sheep farming, lots of sheep bones in Segsbury. And we know from looking at modern sheep farming, modern hill sheep farming, that rams have to be exchanged. You have to introduce new rams into your flock for the genetic health of the flock. And this must have been going on in the Iron Age as well. It was abandoned by the end of the Iron Age. And one very interesting thing is that unlike Uffington, there was absolutely no Roman pottery, nothing Roman whatsoever in Segsbury. And it's only 12 kilometres away, 8 miles away. And I think the reason for this is because Uffington was obviously a sacred place. And we know that the Romans were very keen on adopting and adapting indigenous sacred places to fit with their own pantheon of deities. Whereas Segsbury was very much to do with economics. It was to do with sheep. And we know that the Romans in this area were not at all interested in sheep. What the Romans wanted to do in this area was cereal production. And we'll see that from field systems in a few minutes. The Romans in this area wanted to grow cereals to feed the army. They weren't interested in sheep, and therefore they weren't interested in Segsbury. Alfred's Castle, nice little hill fort in the grounds of Ashdown House. You can see the shape of it. It's sort of roughly hexagonal on the LiDAR. And this is it on the Google image, Google Earth. It's just south of the Ridgeway. It's about 10 kilometres away from Uffington. You can see from this very early aerial photograph and this more recent one that it's not only got a small enclosure, it's actually got a big enclosure attached to it, which is now completely ploughed away, but shows as a crop mark. So all of the dark land that you can see there belongs to the National Trust. This is the garden of Ashdown House. This field belongs to a farmer, and it's been very heavily ploughed, and the large enclosure has completely disappeared. We did excavate trenches along this hedge line, and a large enclosure returns approximately down the hedge line and then joins the small enclosure about there. So what we've got in the small enclosure is one entrance that goes to the outside world and another entrance over there which goes into the big enclosure, because the big enclosure ditch joins just about there. You can see some of our trenches as we excavated Alfred's Castle. Now, obviously, the name Alfred's Castle, was it something to do with Alfred? As I've already said, we know that King Alfred fought the Danes in this area. The earliest reference to Alfred's Castle that we could find was Samuel Lyson's, late 18th century. You can see on his drawn plan, he calls it Alfred's Castle. The chronology of Alfred's Castle is equally as complicated as Uffington. So you can see that it starts with early Bronze Age round barrows. There's several of them, all completely ploughed away. There are linear ditches, 2 linear ditches, one there and one there. There's then the small enclosure and the large enclosure of the same date, early to Middle Iron Age. And the small enclosure was intensely occupied for about 3 centuries. There's a Romano-British farmstead built in the middle of the small enclosure. You can see the ground plan of it there. There was hardly any evidence for late Saxon and the presence of King Alfred. Just to mention this entrance, which is to the southeast, before we did our work, it was thought that that was the original Iron Age entrance into the small enclosure. But what we showed through excavation is that, in fact, the rampart was pushed down into the ditch there in the early Roman period when the farmhouse was built. So that is a Roman entrance to access the building in the middle of there. I call it a farmhouse rather than a villa, because those of you who are Romanists will know that the definition of a villa is somewhat vague. You could call it a small villa, but I'd prefer to call it a farmhouse. This is us digging a hole across the large enclosure crop mark. You can see the crop mark going across the field there. Now, the farmer was extremely unfriendly and he wouldn't let us on. We were here for 3 summers. The first 2 summers he wouldn't let us on. And then the 3rd summer he eventually let us just go and dig a couple of holes. The rampart of Alfred's Castle is completely different to the rampart at Uffington and the rampart at Segsbury. The rampart was constructed from sarsen blocks. These are sarsens. So there was a front face of sarsen stones on top of each other. It was a wall. And at the back of the wall was this compacted chalk up against the sarsen wall with this massive rock cut ditch cut in front of it. If you're not familiar with sarsen stone, and the name is a corruption of Saracen because of the colour of it, Sarsens originally overlay the chalk all across the chalk downlands. So during prehistoric times, Sarsens must have been lying all over the chalk and they were gradually cleared. The big stones at Stonehenge are sarsen stones, as you probably know. So inside Alfred's Castle, we've got lots and lots of Iron Age pits. And in the Iron Age pits, there was evidence for wheat, barley, cows, pigs, sheep. It was a mixed farming economy. Lots of pottery. We got 25 radiocarbon dates and a very good pottery sequence, which dated it to the 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, where it was intensively occupied, lots of roundhouses, sheep farming, wool production. There were quernstones, spindle wheels, all sorts of things. In the early 2nd century AD, this Roman farmhouse was built. Here you can see the ground plan of it. I think this bit in the middle was an open courtyard. There were several rooms, as you can see there. There was window glass, imported pottery from Gaul. We dated it through coins, so it was destroyed, probably burnt down in the 3rd century AD. So it was quite a nice little, perhaps high status farmhouse. So to summarise Alfred's Castle, it's a small occupied area, but permanently occupied. And you could question whether we should actually call it a hill fort or not, or is it more of a sort of enclosed settlement? Obviously, a very different social role to both Segsbury and Uffington. And what I can imagine and what I'd like to suggest is that the people who lived in Alfred's Castle would have taken their sheep along the Ridgeway to Segsbury to trade rams, to take part in various activities at significant parts of the year. Don't forget that these people were farmers, and their religion was based on the agricultural annual cycle. So at certain times of the year, there were prestigious times, and they had to make offerings to the deities and take part in ceremonies. So people from Alfred's Castle going to Segsbury, and the same people probably going to Uffington to take place in whatever sort of worship they did there, worshipping the White Horse, or whatever activities they did associated with the White Horse. In the Romano-British period, all of that changed, and the Downs were now based on villa estates. We've seen one in Alfred's Castle. There's another one not far away from Alfred's called Weathercock Hill. There's another one in the other direction called Starville Farm. There's a whole series of Roman villas across the Downs in this area. And of course, what we can't forget is the landscape around these sites. On the right here, we've got Segsbury Camp and the Ridgeway. And all of these red marks that you see here are fields and field systems that what used to be English heritage is now Historic England, have mapped from aerial photography. Most of them show as crop marks, as you can see there. Some still survive as humps and bumps in the ground, as you can see there. But what dating has been done on these field systems suggests that they were Roman rather than late prehistoric or Iron Age. But of course, there must have been Iron Age fields, because not only at Alfred's, but also at Segsbury, we got evidence for wheat and barley being grown. On the left here, on the left, that's Segsbury again. And all the blue dots that you can see are the finds from metal detecting rallies that have taken place over the years around Segsbury. Fortunately, these rallies have been done in cooperation with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, so finds have been logged, and all the blue dots that you can see are Roman finds. So lots of Roman activity, and notice how the Roman finds correlate with the field systems to a large extent around there. So the conclusions then, I mean, what I think I've tried to do is to question the category of hill fort and show that even though they all look the same on the surface, when you actually get down to the detail of excavation, they are quite different in terms of chronology and in terms of function. We must think of these things in terms of what these days are called relational landscapes. So you don't just look at one site in isolation, you understand the site in relation to the landscape around it and its relationship with other sites. And also I've introduced this idea of prehistoric history, people going back to the same place time and time again, because it had some kind of historical significance to them. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lock. That was fantastically interesting and really great. And thank you also for popping in the landscape context, which was really useful. Thank you. We do have some questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If I can work out how to do this. All right. Sorry. Could you clarify whether Uffington and Segsbury were used at the same time? It's a question from Andrew.
There's some overlap, but they started and finished in slightly different times. If we're talking Iron Age here, Uffington started in the 7th century, was remodeled in the 4th century BC, whereas Segsbury was first constructed in the 6th century BC, and by the 2nd century it was finished. But of course, what we've got at Uffington that we don't get at Segsbury is Roman reuse of it. So it depends whether you're just talking about Iron Age or whether you're talking about Roman as well.
Okay, thank you. If I may sneak a quick one in there as well, actually. I've always been rather fascinated by the relationship between Uffington and the very nearby forts at Hardwell Camp and Rams Hill. It's the same question, really. Is there any suggestion from your work at Uffington that they might have been operating at the same time? Sorry, have I lost everybody?
Hey Dan, you're still there. Professor Lock might have dropped for a second though. Just give him a moment. Is there any questions you might be able to answer, Dan? So there was a question I noticed about the finds from Alfred's castle. Do we know where they're housed?
I'm afraid not. I would imagine that the majority will be in Stanton Harcourt Oxford Museum store, but I'm afraid I don't know.
Any other stuff? Professor Lock, are you able to? Can you hear us? Oh well. Any questions? Please do continue putting questions in. We'll leave it open for a moment. If the professor comes back on, that'll be great. We'll get him to answer them. If not, what we'll do is we'll collate the questions and make them available on the YouTube. We'll publish this video will be published on YouTube, so it can be watched again, and we'll publish all the answers to the questions on the YouTube's underneath the transcripts there. Apologies that we've had a bit of a technical issue with that, but hopefully you all enjoyed the talk as much as I did.
I certainly did. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's great that you're supporting it, so thank you. Should we close the meeting there, do you think, Ian?
I think, yeah, unfortunately, very sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on and listening to Professor Lock. And for the answers to the questions, please do have a look on the YouTube when we publish that. Keep an eye on the Ridgeway Facebook page and Friends of the Ridgeway Facebook page as well for more upcoming events. And yeah, I hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Oh, got a hand up, Dave Kavanagh. Did you want to say anything, Dave? Can I allow Mike? No. Yeah. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.
And thanks, Professor Lock, if you can still hear us.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.